I'm sure you've seen from the invite that went out yesterday and the reminder today, we've had a change in presenters, and we're really grateful to have Wendy Moore from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre join us today with Interim Commissioner Isabelle Crompton. And Wendy has very generously offered to provide a welcome to country. So I'm going to throw over now to Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks, Megs. Ya nina mapili, Kulingana, Milatina, Palawa. Warranta, Tapani Lumi, Nipaluna. Kani, Pumili, Luwitina, Takarili, Nari. Hello and welcome everyone today to on the land that you're at. I'm not sure if you're in Nipaluna or maybe at Patawai or Tulaminakali, but welcome, and I want you to sit today in your lands and think about what was happening on these lands 200 to 250 years ago, and how my ancestors were caring for their children, and how it was very much a village of people that were raising and caring and making rules and laws for their children. And in particular, when you're thinking about that, think about even 100 years ago and how our communities were very much a village, and how today I hope that our conversations are about how we together through this draft bill can create a community and a village to raise our children safely. Thanks, Meg.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And before we kick off with the program, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Nipaluna, Hobart, and really just pay my respects to ancestors past and present, and to acknowledge what Wendy has just said, the strength of Aboriginal community that is ongoing, and that we're so lucky that we're able to learn from in this country. And hopefully this new role that is outlined in the bill will give us all the opportunity to continue that wisdom and knowledge to benefit Tasmanian children and families. Thanks again, everyone, for attending today. The intention of the session today is to have a discussion about the ongoing consultation in the draft bill, setting up the new Commission for Children and Young People. This bill relates to several Commission of Inquiry recommendations, and we'll provide a very brief overview of those recommendations today, but mainly it's an opportunity for us to hear from two community leaders and experts, Interim Commissioner Isabelle Crompton, who's with the Office of the Commissioner for Children and Young People, and Wendy Moore from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, who is also a representative on the National Safe and Supported Framework and a board member of SNAKE. So coming with expertise that relates not just to the Tasmanian context, but also to that national framework. Just a kind of short housekeeping before we get started. If you don't mind, we might take questions at the end, just because we're hoping to have a little bit more of a conversation today. Feel free to put your questions in the chat to be raised when we've kind of finished the presentation portion of the session today, or at the end when we've got questions, we'd invite you to raise your hand using the hand raise function on Teams, just so that we can attend to the questions as they come in. We're really fortunate today to have some representatives from DPAC and Justice in this session. So if there are questions that relate to the technical drafting of the bill, or issues that are kind of best directed to people from government, then there might be opportunities for questions to be answered, or for questions to be taken on notice. We will be providing a little bit of information at the end of the session on how people can get involved in the consultation process. And if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself on mute, please, just because we've got quite a few people in the session today, which is really fantastic. We'll make a copy of the slides available after the session, and the recording will also be available. It's being recorded as well. So we might introduce our esteemed guests now, please. So Isabelle Crompton is the Interim Commissioner for Children and Young People. Isabelle is a legal and policy expert with extensive experience defending and safeguarding the rights of children and young people. Originally from the northwest of Tasmania, she studied law in Hobart at the University of Tasmania and worked for a number of years in practice, including as a criminal defence solicitor for Tasmania Legal Aid. She's worked at the Office of the Commissioner for Children and Young People for over a decade in a number of policy and leadership roles, and was appointed as Interim Commissioner for Children and Young People in October 2024. So thanks very much, Isabelle. And we're also joined today by Wendy Moore, who is the Family and Children's Program Manager at the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. Wendy is a proud Palawa woman from Lutruwita, Tasmania, with family connections to the Furneaux Islands, specifically Cape Barren and Flinders Island. A qualified social worker with 2 decades experience working with Tasmanian children and families, Wendy is the statewide Family and Children's Program Manager at the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, board member of SNAKE, and member of the National Safe and Supported Aboriginal Leadership Group. She's also completed international study tours, investigating First Nations culture and community-based initiatives, as well as participating in key Australian networks to support and strengthen the rights of Tasmanian Aboriginal children and families. So thank you both so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise with us. I might ask both of you just to kind of frame the session by giving us a bit of an overview of your roles. So perhaps Isabelle, you first. Could you please tell us about your current role and what the functions of your role and office are, I guess in the contexts of the proposed changes that the bill is introducing?
Yeah, thank you, Meg. And can you hear me? I'm just checking. I've just taken myself off mute. Great. Thanks so much for arranging this conversation. It's just great, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It's my privilege to be in this role, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation today. And thank you, Wendy, for that beautiful welcome to country and for really centering us and just enabling us, I think, to just remember the importance of community and caring for and raising our children. And obviously Palawa people have done that in connection with their country and culture here for time immemorial. So I'm meeting you here from Nipaluna, Hobart, the ancient lands of the Muwanina people. So from the outset, I think it's just really great to have an opportunity to speak to people who may not know a lot about the role of the Commissioner, or they may know something about the Commissioner's role, but I think I can hopefully give you some context and it might elicit some questions. So Tassie was one of the first Australian jurisdictions to have a Children's Commissioner. First Commissioner was appointed in 2000. So it's a really interesting time, I think, to be having this conversation about the establishment of what could potentially be a truly nation-leading child rights, safety and wellbeing oversight body. It's sort of bringing us full circle. So I think it's important to understand that, while the role's been around since 2000, there have been some changes. So 2016 is the legislation that I'm currently working under, and it really adopts a lot of the functions that existed under the old legislation. So the Commissioner is an independent and impartial statutory officer, performing functions independent of government, but the Office of the Commissioner is currently a business unit within the Department for Education, Children and Young People. And obviously the bill that we're discussing, one of the big changes it would do is to change that. So as Commissioner, I have, I guess the job description set out in the legislation. So it's a general advocacy role for all children in the state. And I can advocate for individual children who are detained under the Youth Justice Act, but not for other individual children. It's a collective advocacy role more generally. The role also includes really influencing policy development, and to do that we can undertake research. We can also investigate systemic matters. There's a monitoring and reviewing function, so that relates to children's wellbeing generally, and by wellbeing I mean that really broad concept of wellbeing that we know so well here in Tasmania, and a really important focus on encouraging, empowering, promoting children's participation in decisions that affect them, and also encouraging organisations to develop child-friendly mechanisms to ensure that children can participate in matters that affect them within organisations. And then we work within a rights-based framework, so there is a specific function that asks us to, or the Commissioner, to help ensure that the state meets its national and international obligations in respect to children and young people. And so, the principles that underpin or inform the way the role is performed include that obligation to consider rights of children, including under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Act, as it currently stands, asks the Commissioner to give serious regard or consideration to the needs of children who are vulnerable or disadvantaged, but the remit is actually very broad, so it covers policy issues or areas as diverse as the state's response to the need for climate change action, to homelessness, intimate partner or family violence, employment law, just to name a few. And there are some things that we can't do as well. So as Commissioner, I can't investigate decisions relating to individual children or specific circumstances unless I'm asked to do so by the Minister, and in this case it's the Minister for Children and Youth. I also can't administer a visitor program, for example, to children in care. And I'm not a regulator, so I don't regulate, for example, the Child and Youth Safe Standards or reportable conduct. That sits with the Office of the Independent Regulator, and I think we might have someone from that office or some people from that office here today. So it's not my role to speak for government, so I'm really pleased that there are people here from DPAC and DOJ who might be able to respond to questions people might have about the bill. But I think hopefully that gives you a bit of context that we can jump off into the conversation from.
Yes, thank you so much. And maybe just one final point just about monitoring and oversight, and what monitoring and oversight is currently provided for your office, just as it currently stands.
Yeah, okay. So I guess at the end of the day, we're not a decision maker. So we influence, we monitor, we understand, we scan for emerging strategic issues. We monitor data on a regular basis and other information which can be gathered through a range of different mechanisms. It can be through, ad hoc conversations all the way through to quite specific and targeted consultation processes. And that information in turn helps inform how I perform that systemic advocacy or advisory role. Sometimes that can trigger a systemic investigation. So we do have an investigation, like an own motion power of investigation, which was something that was introduced in the 2016 legislation. Sometimes, there can be some challenges associated with the scope of the role. I know the former Commissioner spoke at length during the Commission of Inquiry about some of the vagaries around some of the functions of the legislation and how it is that we sort of get to the point where, for example, we can monitor the out-of-home care system. We're really hoping through this bill that there'll be some of those vagaries will be resolved, and that the legislation is really explicit in the functions that the Commission can perform, and that really sort of equates with what the community and children expect an office like this or a commission going forward should be able to do. We do provide rights-based feedback on a range of legislative and policy reforms. And we can also provide proactive formal advice or recommendations to government on a range of issues. So as an example, advocating really strongly for the implementation of the Child Safe Standards and reportable conduct schemes. That's been a long-standing area of advocacy for this office, right back from, I think it was when Commissioner Morrissey was in the role. Raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility, reforms to strip searching laws. But as I said, there are some existing limitations in relation to the role that were explored during the Commission of Inquiry.
Thank you for providing that overview, Isabelle. And, obviously we want to continue being nation leading. So I think this is a really important moment to turn to Wendy to maybe give us an overview of Safe and Supported in general, but also the work of the Aboriginal Leadership Group and how we're hoping that work might influence these developments that are happening here in Tasmania.
Excellent. Thanks, Meg. I'm just going to try and be as quick as I can, because anyone that knows me knows that I'm going to talk forever. So I'm going to try and make this succinct. So for anyone that doesn't know, the Safe and Supported is a national framework. It was launched 2021 and it was a 10-year plan. And it was launched to ensure that all children in Australia grow up safe and connected to their family, community and culture. And it builds on the national framework for protecting Australian children. Within that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have developed our own action plan. So there's the national action plan, and then sitting next to it is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander first action plan. And we call it the first one because it's for 5 years, and then there's a second one for the next 5 years. So it's a 10-year plan. And the plan of the purpose of the action plan is to support Target 12 of closing the gap, so to reduce the over-representation of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. Now, and I'm going to answer in lots of different ways to your question, Meg. The plan itself is driven by a partnership because it needs that power. And that partnership is the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group and the Commonwealth, state and territory governments. And they've all of which have signed on an agreement that formalises shared decision-making arrangements. So we have that sense of power that we are all equals and we can make decision-making, which is, thank you, Meg, for putting that up. What is the role of the Aboriginal Leadership Group and who are they? The Leadership Group is convened and chaired by SNAIC. And as Meg mentioned, I'm also a member, I'm a director on the SNAIC board. So SNAIC convene and chair it, and most of it is done co-chaired with DSS nationally. Membership within the leadership group include jurisdictional peak reps, so that's myself, so I'm down from intellectual Weta, I'm on there. There's subject matter experts. We have a couple of Aboriginal professors who have done a lot of work in this space, and we also have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander commissioners and guardians. Now, they may be an Aboriginal commissioner or a commissioner for Aboriginal children, but either way, they're an Aboriginal person. Now, this group sits at the table. We meet regularly. There is so much work within the 8 actions. We've broken it down into 4 groups. So we have 4 different groups, and we've got some representatives from DSIP on each of those groups, and I sit within those groups. So we're trying. It's so much work to do, but we are really trying hard. But today we're just going to talk about Action 7. And so Action 7 is accountability and oversight, which is, for the purposes of our conversation today, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children. What we do is, as a leadership group, we sit in the room with our community service ministers and our children and family secretaries. And so we come together at various times to try and push forward agreed plans. And we've been having some traction on a piece of work under Action 7, which is the minimum standards or minimum requirements. And I could change the way I talk about it. But what they are is a set of standards or requirements on what the National Aboriginal Children's Commissioner would look like. And so the leadership group have been doing that. We are Aboriginal only. We are the voices of our community and our children, and we are very much about trying to make really significant changes on the national level. And today, for me, not only is it about national, it's about this draft bill on a jurisdictional level. Now, Meg, I'm going to stop because I could just keep talking.
Thank you very much for that, Wendy. And yes, I've shared some documents from the action plan in the chat. So really encourage people to be reflecting on what Wendy and Isabelle will be talking about today in the context of those national developments as you're thinking about how you might respond to the bill. But we might start with what is going to obviously be the driest and hopefully therefore the quickest part of this presentation today, which is an overview of how did we get here. And this bill is one of many, many recommendations that were made during the Commission of Inquiry, and the formation of this legislation, which is, a very difficult task, I might say, because it is proposing some really significant changes, really relates to several of the Commission of Inquiry recommendations. I haven't put all of them up on the slide, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that there are many different things that the Commission of Inquiry were talking about when they were proposing this new model. So just to give a very brief overview, this new legislation is establishing a new commission comprised of 3 roles. So the Commissioner for Children and Young People, the Aboriginal Commissioner, as you've heard, that's something that's also being explored at a national level and in other jurisdictions as well, and the Child Advocate. So the Commission would comprise those 3 roles together. The functions that are going to be proposed by the Commissioner include significant responsibilities in relation to existing frameworks and legislation, including the Child and Youth Safe Organisational Framework, which is something that many people on this chat would be familiar with already. It also includes providing education for entities, overseeing and enforcing compliance with standards, and then some new initiatives that are also introduced or will be introduced as part of the implementation of recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry, such as the Community Visitor Scheme. And it includes functions that are similar to, but in some cases expanded on what the Commissioner or the Office of the Commissioner already provides. So that includes advocating for individual children in out-of-home care and youth detention, and supporting children to make complaints to the Ombudsman and apply for independent reviews of department decision-making, monitoring the operation of the out-of-home care and youth justice systems, including conducting own motion inquiries where relevant and justified, recommending improvements to government for the out-of-home care and youth justice system. So that could be relating to broad systemic change. Again, this is something that the Commissioner's Office is doing already, but it's framed up in a slightly different way, particularly with the inclusion of the Aboriginal Commissioner and the Child Advocate and the strength that the inclusion of those professionals would also bring to that office. Promoting the participation of children in out-of-home care and youth justice systems, particularly in decisions that affect the lives of those children and their families, and upholding and promoting the rights of children in out-of-home care and youth justice systems, as well as a rights promotion. You've heard from Isabelle already that promoting and upholding the rights of children is already something that is integral to the work of the Commissioner's Office. There were also some really clear messages given throughout the Commission of Inquiry about the importance of independence, which is something that we're going to be talking about a little bit further on. And there are some recommendations that relate to how the independence of the Commission can be safeguarded and strengthened. That includes recommendations in relation to the staffing and recruitment of the office. It also includes a recommendation that the office has to be properly resourced so that they can, the people who work in the office can fulfill the functions that are intended to provide really robust oversight and monitoring, as well as all of that work responding to the needs of children who are in those situations of vulnerability, such as out-of-home care and youth detention. So there's quite a lot that this new bill is proposing to do. So I think I'd like to start by maybe asking you, Isabelle, just to kind of centre the conversation that we're having today on what you actually hear as Commissioner and what the other staff in your office hear. You know, you're speaking to Tasmanian children on a regular basis. What are some of the issues that you hear that are most important to those children, and how is the bill going to support addressing those issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Meg. I think we engage with children in a range of different ways. And I think it's, we do that through formal mechanisms. For example, we there's an obligation under the existing legislation, which I think is carried through in the draft bill, to have a consultative committee or council of young people who can express their views directly to the Commissioner. And that's been done over, the time I've been here, which is more than 10 years, in a variety of different ways, including through SRCs and regional groups, sort of forming a broader council, and more recently through sort of a co-design process. We've had the CCYP Ambassador Program, which at times has had, I think, close to probably 280 children involved. that program's currently on pause at the moment just because of the timeframes of the establishment of the new commission, but we continue to run our YEP program, which is an engagement place on our website. And early this year, Commissioner McLean established a new consultative group, which is now known pretty well, I think, across the community as the Voices for Tasmanian Youth. And they've been working really closely with our office, really as a secretariat, I'd say, to ensure that the voices of children and young people are being heard as the government develops its Change for Children strategy, which is that 10-year strategy, which is another recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry. So they're meeting with us, they're meeting with government decision makers and providing some ongoing advice on various stages of the reforms. But I guess in terms of, you know, what we're hearing from children, we're hearing that through ad hoc engagement, through the council, through specific engagements, through children that we're advocating for at Ashley, and children who just, you know, decide that they would like to contact us to raise a particular issue with us, and through our monitoring of the out-of-home care system. I think one of the things that we're really hearing loud and clearly, and I know that others doing this work hear loud and clearly as well, is that children need a powerful advocate, someone in their corner, someone that is looking out for them, that can advocate on their behalf and do so independently of decision makers and really promote and be a champion for their participation in decisions that affect them. So through, for example, the monitoring of the out-of-home care system, that sort of ongoing monitoring led to a young person contacting our office, which in turn led to Commissioner McLean undertaking an investigation into a change to case management for children, or for some children in out-of-home care. And as a consequence of that, that process, and through some really strong sort of preliminary engagement with children and young people, we designed a process through which this office could hear from children about their experience of that change. We ended up engaging with more than 70 children and young people, and a range of adults working with and for them, and carers. And we've heard really strongly around that sort of sense of needing that really strong, trusted, reliable adult in their lives to contribute to their sense of safety, actual safety and also felt safety. And, you know, people can have a look at our website to see some of the other reports that we've released, but for example, just late last year, Somebody in Your Corner report, which again talks about what children really value, which is around physical safety, which is just completely unsurprising. Having privacy and that sense of the importance of having some control over how your information is shared. Being safe emotionally and having that really strong sense of belonging. And we hear that sense of belonging as being incredibly important from children across the community. Ultimately, just having someone, a trusted, safe, supportive, strong adult who can really go into bat for children and young people is just it's just a common theme across all forms of engagement. It comes up in our Youth Justice Voices project, so that's a project that's included in-depth interviews with young people who've had contact with the youth justice system. We also hear from them about the importance of family and community, and I think Wendy might want to talk to that as well, particularly for Aboriginal children and young people. But that absence of positive, strong relationships, or presence of negative or not so great relationships is something that young people identify as having real implications for their experience as community members. I might stop there because, like Wendy, I could just keep talking.
Well,
I'm sorry, Meg. I'm sorry.
No, never apologise.
There's just so much to say.
Well, before we move to Wendy, though, I would like just a quick reflection from you on how do you see the bill is working towards strengthening those things that have been identified by Tasmanian children as the most important functions, I suppose, of the Commission and their office?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, absolutely, my expectation is that an outcome of this, what is effectively a once in a generation system change, is that children feel a far greater sense of safety and a greater sense of belonging, and all of those things that they're asking their community for, and a really strong sense within the legislation of children being respected as citizens in their own right. There are some things with the bill that I think provide for a greater recognition of children's agency, including the ability to participate in the decision-making processes about who will have the statutory roles as part of this new commission. I think that's really important, that children they'll have a really integral role in the selection of those people who will be in those statutory roles as part of the commission, or however the legislation lands. The other thing I think is really important is the establishment of a new visitor scheme that would enable the Commission to have that ongoing regular contact, particularly with children in the out-of-home care space. So, as I said earlier, that's something that's outside the remit of the existing Commissioner's functions, but having that independence the current advocate for children in out-of-home care currently sits with the department and doing a wonderful job maintaining contact with children and young people. But ultimately, I think having an independent statutory role and scheme established so that there's that really proactive check-in with children around the state, no matter what type of care placement they're in, and then the ability where things come up to actually be able to go into bat for individual children in care, ranging from sort of, resolving issues at the local level all the way through to potentially going to, say, TasCAT, the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, to seek a review of a decision. I think that sends a very strong message to children and young people that they are agents in their own lives, that their views do matter, and that where administrative decisions are being made that affect them, that there are mechanisms through which to challenge those decisions and to ensure that children's best interests and their voices are at the centre of those decisions. I hope that helps respond to that question, Meg.
Yes, no, it does. And I think that's also a great point, I think, for us to move to Wendy, because I think the role of the Aboriginal Commissioner is so important in that early intervention and engagement with Aboriginal children and families in particular that we know is so important. So perhaps, Wendy, we might turn to you to talk about one of the major changes of the bill, which is the introduction of the Aboriginal Commissioner for Children and Young People. So obviously this is happening within a national kind of landscape of changes happening in other areas. So I'd love to hear from you about what you see as the kind of key, what ideally is the introduction of this role going to mean in terms of the changes that we can see for all Tasmanians, but also particularly for Tasmanian Aboriginal children and families. And are there good examples from other jurisdictions that you know of where you think that balance is sitting well in terms of the role of the Aboriginal Commissioner, thinking about those issues that we were discussing before, such as independence and oversight? And
no problems. Thanks. And thanks, Izzy. That I agree with, particularly about your common themes. We're definitely hearing that. So I'm going to maybe break this down to a couple of different paragraphs. The first one is to say, when I was talking about the minimum requirements earlier, they are a set of, as I said, a set of standards which we as the Aboriginal Leadership Group and governments, because they have signed on as partners, are there to not just shape the National Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, but to shape the jurisdictional legislation. And so we note at the moment, so for your information, the National Aboriginal Commissioner is coming operational by the 13th of January 2025. They will not be as independent because it will not be legislated. They won't be independent at all. They'll be sitting inside an agency, but it's a start. The second thing to say is that with regards to these minimum standards, at the moment, we've got several jurisdictions that have totally agreed to saying, yep, we will adopt them and implement them in each of our state and territories. And I can say it's South Australia, ACT, Queensland and Victoria. Now, some of the other jurisdictions are have some red line issues and are just pushing back, and some others are saying we just need more time. We were hoping to have these minimum standards adopted by now, and sadly we haven't, but we do hope that they'll be adopted within the next couple of months. We've got a shared decision-making meeting coming up, and we hope to have those adopted by that time. To talk about so also for your information, currently across Australia, there are most states and territories, excluding literally Tasmania, have a Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, or an Aboriginal Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, or a Guardian or an Advocate. So in Little Witter, we're the only jurisdiction without any voice in that space. South Australia are the closest to, I think, Meg, your question was, you know, what can you see of this? South Australia do a great job and are very much almost aligned with the minimum standards. They are an independent commission. They sit outside of the other commissioners. They sit alone. They have their own office. They work alongside of each other, and they've worked through the nuances of how that worked, and they have great relationships, and they can do advocacy and oversight together with the Ombudsman. Now, from learning from April in South Australia as the Aboriginal Commissioner, she's really clearly sharing with us that the need to be independent and autonomous from the other agencies, the other commissioners, is so important. And her reasons that she provides are exactly the same reasons that, the same voices that I have heard through the last 12 months. And that's a segue there to say that for the last 12 months, I've been working on a project, working with community on how we can really do some massive reform within government to keep our Aboriginal children safe. So we've gone around and we've spoken to, we've heard the voices of nearly 180 Aboriginal community members this year, and that includes from an 8-year-old through to an 87-year-old. And we've talked and we've listened, and what we heard, and it's been really, really powerful, is that whatever happens, the Aboriginal Commissioner needs to be independent. They need to sit outside of any other agency or office. So not to sit next to, and this has nothing to do with Izzy, not to sit in the same office as Izzy. It's to do with, and it goes back to what you were saying, Izzy, about that sense of trust, safety, respect, and having, and for Aboriginal children, it's the key message we keep hearing is we want to know who the Commissioner is. We want to know who their staff are, and we want to connect to them. Now, obviously, through the Commission of Inquiry and just what we know is our children have an understandable distrust of government agencies and the system, and it's very real. And the thought of going into an office where there's a non-Aboriginal person has freaked them out. Now, I can give you a real example, and that is we used to have a program in Launceston of our youth justice workers who would go from the TAC into Ashley and meet with our Aboriginal children. And it was, I think it stopped about 10 years ago, which was really sad. But it didn't just stop for funding, but it also because what we were hearing from the young people in Ashley was, you're actually coming in and we feel like you're part of the Ashley community. We don't trust you. And so and it was Jay at the time, and what Jay would try and do is get them out of Ashley, go on country, go and do something and make them and build up his relationship and trust. And then sadly, something would happen, he couldn't be there to advocate, support them, whatever it was, and they'd go, well, you're useless. You're useless to us, Joe. You're just like everyone else. We need someone that's independent, that's here for us. And so for us, if this position, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, was sitting in the same office with the Commissioner and the Child's Advocate, there would be significant worries from the community and from our young people. The second part of that is, and Izzy, you touched on it as well, it was about having our own budget. Currently within the bill, it looks like, you know, there's a head of agency, and at the moment it's would be the Commissioner. So is that the Aboriginal Commissioner would have to negotiate for budgets, negotiate for staff. That's not something we want to do. We want to be independent. We want to have our own budget. We want to do the same as what Izzy was saying. We want to have our own selection panel. We want to give our young people agency to choose, to be a part of the recruitment, not just from the Commissioner, from the staff, so that they know that they feel safe and trusted. The other part of that is having our own office would enable us to collect and store our information and data, which is another action of Safe and Supported, which is data sovereignty. So really having an ownership of that and pushing through on that. And the other one is, as I said, is reporting. We want to be able to report as independent bodies, as an independent person, reporting on what we think is important, not necessarily what the entire office thinks that we need to do. I'm trying to think, Meg, what else your question was, because I've gone off again. I apologise.
Well, you've also sort of, I would love to pick up on, and I don't know if, I don't know what there is out there about this, but I think something that I would be very interested to know is in South Australia, where they have the independent, where the independence is more safeguarded in the model that they've chosen. How has the Commissioner in South Australia, though, felt that role, even though it's separate to the role of the Commissioner and the other kind of entity, is it influencing as well the policy and legislative? You know, is that Aboriginal Commission still kind of influencing how the Commission generally performs its work? Because I would imagine that would be one of the strengths of having the role of the Aboriginal Commissioner embedded within an office, that hopefully that is experience and connection that would then kind of transmit to the role of the entire agency, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good question. April has been sharing with us that she's developed some really strong relationships with the Commissioner for Children over there, and that what she finds is more powerful, and I understand what you're saying, how do they work together? April finds it more powerful when she gets in the room with the other Aboriginal Commissioners, or the Commissioners for Aboriginal Children, and in the future next year will be with the National Commissioner. And as a group of Aboriginal people, they will be able to lead and shape and reshape the changes and reforms that are required. And so April's been telling us, yes, there has been some times when, you know, she's had to work, and maybe Izzy might know a bit more about this, because I'm not a commissioner and I don't sit in the room at these meetings where they all, because I do know that the April has and the commissioners they do have regular meetings.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
Yeah, sorry, Izzy, you go.
No, I was just going to say the First Nations caucus of the Australian and New Zealand Children's Commissioners, Guardians and Advocates, which is a very long name for the group of commissioners, they are very powerful in terms of influencing the policy positions of commissioners nationally, I would say, and in fact their key priorities. So the First Nations commissioners' key priorities have been adopted by the broader group. So I think that's a really good example of that sort of strength of that collective advocacy. And just quickly on South Australia, there is no commission in South Australia. So there's a Commissioner for Children and Young People. There's the Guardian, who is also the training centre visitor, and has some other functions as well, which is specifically focused on children in care and children who are placed in youth justice detention. And then there's April's office, which is the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, And I think there's another, as part of their oversight sort of framework, I think there's also a council body as well. So yeah, really, and as Wendy said, I think that approach is being seen as being closer to the sort of the national minimum requirements that are being developed by the groups that Wendy's a member of. It is different, though, from the model that the Commission of Inquiry has recommended. So I think we just name that up. But that's a really live conversation, because I think, as Wendy said, the community needs to trust in its independent statutory officer. At the end of the day, that's what this is about. It's about, ensuring the community has a really strong sense that personal body, or whoever, however you name it up, is there for their kids.
Definitely. And I mean, even if it's not what has been recommended in the Commission of Inquiry final report, it's certainly consistent with the key messages in Chapter 18, which is, the part of the final report talking about change. The importance of independence was something that was really, very clearly articulated. So I don't see that it would necessarily be inconsistent. I mean, I know we've got to open up for questions soon, but I would actually love to get both of your thoughts before we maybe suggest that people start putting questions in the chat or put your hands up. Something else, another model that TasCOSS has sort of been advocating for in other forums is a model similar to what exists in the ACT, where these roles operate under within a Human Rights Commission framework, for example. And I wonder if either of you would be willing to share your thoughts on that model, whether that could be a potential something. If we are to have a commission, is that something that would perhaps strengthen what we're looking for, which is really the rights of children and families?
Can I just jump in there to say thanks, Izzy, for about the Commission of Inquiry, and I forgot to mention that with the recommendation. And what I can say to that is, I think basically the government's in a bit of an issue, because yes, we've accepted the Commission of Inquiry recommendations, and Meg beautifully about that other chapter, reshaping that. But what has also happened is government has signed up to the minimum requirements. We're partly on. So now for me, if you've got these two statements being made, how do you shape that? Well, you shape it by the people that are most affected, which is the Aboriginal community. And we're saying we want to be independent. And going back to Meg, your question on the Human Rights Commission, we on a national level, and I've forgotten the president's name, and Anne Hollins came and met with us a couple of weeks ago to talk about that actual option. And as a leadership group, we did decline it. And it very much to do with, again, about that independence and autonomy. We really need to sit separately. And I think, again, Izzy, you mentioned it earlier, the time is now. If we do not get this right now, we're never going to get this changed again in the legislation. So if we get it right and we really listen with our ears, and by making the actions, I think we can make some really significant changes by allowing the voices of the Aboriginal people to be heard, and this to be an Aboriginal-led process. I'm going to mic myself now. Shush now, Wendy.
I think just, Wendy, that self-determining, that right to self-determination is something that I've been advocating for really strongly, and it is. Meg, you're right. I mean, the reform is complex reform. It brings together a range of different existing statutory functions, adding in a whole range of new ones. At the end of the day, it requires really deliberative decision-making, and by deliberative, that means really listening to community and communities, across the state, Aboriginal and I don't know how you describe it, Wendy, mainstream maybe, and to inform that process. And I think it's really great to be able to have these kinds of conversations with a whole range of people. It's amazing. I think there are 56 people online today. How fabulous is that? And to really be able to sort of, have a conversation about some of these issues that, and you're quite right, Meg, that the chapter in the Commission of Inquiry report really does talk about the importance of the Commission for Aboriginal Children and Young People having that real independence. So yeah, I mean, I think it's great that people are having the opportunity to engage with this level of discussion, because it requires it. It requires it. Yeah.
And we'll be sending out some links after the session, and very happy to link to the South Australian materials as well, so that people can have a look at what we're talking about. And we do have a question in the chat now, though, so I'd love to read that one out if that's okay. So, can the presenters confirm whether the out-of-home care powers include coverage of children in respite that may be through a private provider, noting that DSIP lists respite under out-of-home care? Is it only respite arranged through child safety, or can community visitors, etc., be requested for those accessing private respite? I think this question might be about oversight for children who are maybe, under the NDIS, for example, receiving supports, at home, or I hope that's being faithful to your question, Julie. Is this something that's currently covered either in the Commissioner's current role, or is it proposed in the expanded powers of the bill?
Shall I respond to that initially, and then maybe someone from Justice or DPAC can jump in if to go to the specifics. So existing role, we have a general oversight function that would enable us to consider the rights and wellbeing of children in that context generally, but not individual children. The question of whether the visitor scheme, for example, the advocacy role, would apply to children in that cohort, I think is a live one. We're doing some work to analyse the, definitions and so forth that are in the draft bill, and I think the definition of out-of-home care is one that may, I think it's likely to be something that I'll focus on in my submission. I don't know if someone from Justice or DPAC wants to talk to that, but I think there could be some benefit in greater clarification. I think Vinton's got his hand up.
It's Bruce Patterson here.
Sorry, Bruce.
That's all right. Vinton is here from the department. We're all, and Isabelle Crompton, all from the strategic legislation team, and really pleased to be invited along. Just on this particular question, the bill currently doesn't explicitly exclude private respite from that coverage, and so we are really interested in, as we work through the consultation period, on what people think that jurisdictional coverage should be and whether private respite should be included or not. So it's a good point, good question.
It's also a really good question because we now will have the disability inclusion and safeguarding legislation, which will apply to children, potentially to children with disability in these kinds of placement arrangements or respite arrangements. And it's something I'm going to be discussing further, just that interrelationship, to sort of help my understanding the interrelationship between that new legislation and the Commission bill or draft bill.
The other thing that I would say, Julie, to your question, is it's something that, depending on the type of situation that you're describing, it's possible that it might fall within the jurisdiction of the Tasmanian National Preventative Mechanism under OPCAT. It might not cover, the wording in the bill, I've just got it up because I couldn't remember, but it's a hospital or other similar place. And I know that TasCOSS, among other people, were kind of very strongly advocating for a very broad expansion of what the NPM, who is the body overseeing that those commitments that the Tasmanian Government have made, we wanted that to be interpreted in a way that was as broad as possible, specifically to cover this type of situation for children who are still really likely to be experiencing vulnerability, but who aren't within those kind of more formalised settings. So that is definitely something that I would encourage you to think about. The Tasmanian NPM is operational, so that's something that that's an area where you might be able to find recourse. Thank you. We've got 4 minutes. I don't know how that happened. I think that there's a comment in the chat that I would just direct people to. It's more of a call out for experiences. So maybe I'll just direct everyone to kind of have a look at that message and get in touch with Joanna if you've got any recommendations for her. Any other questions? Oh no, that's someone coming in, not a question. I would love to hear, if we don't have any more questions, maybe just your sort of, I don't know, key takeaways from both of you as we're heading into the consultation process. We've got the details up on that slide there, so we all have another month to get our submissions in. You know, maybe 1 or 2 things that both of you would really encourage people who are attending this session today to bear in mind when they're preparing their consultation, or whether they would like to make a consultation. Perhaps maybe, Wendy, do you maybe want to kick us off with what you would really recommend people have in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I think for me, it's very much about, if you do write a submission, think about it through the eyes, and I'm assuming everyone will be thinking through the eyes of the child, but also thinking through the eyes, for me, for an Aboriginal child, and what we clearly have heard from our children, that they want to work with. If this is going to work, it needs to be set up with an agency or an office that they can trust, that's safe, and more importantly, that is known to them, because that is the way we do business. It's about knowing and connections to people. And if our young children can't do that, then the chances of change and keeping them safe through this office is going to be extremely limited. And always happy if anyone wanted to contact me individually to have a yarn about any part of that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Isabelle, if you don't mind, I can see that the department have their hand up. I might throw to...
I did just want to say, it's Bruce again, in relation to the independence of the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, it's a really important point and issue that I know the Department of Premier and Cabinet and we want to continue to engage with the community on, because as people will discuss, the bill, or perhaps I should just say, the bill is obviously very much a draft bill that reflects the COI recommendations, and this extended consultation period is really important to kind of refine and develop it and take into account other initiatives and reforms. I mean, practically, I believe the Commission and certainly ourselves see the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People as being an independent statutory officer, even if being part of the Commission as a whole, they're all independent in nature of their statutory positions. And government, I think, in its budget setting process would be setting budget accordingly to make sure all those officers can fulfil their functions. But I guess the short version is, without rambling on too much, we're really keen to continue to work with community on that issue.
That's very good to hear. Thanks. And I might just throw to Isabelle before we finish up. I know it's 1 o'clock, so thank you very much for your patience, everyone.
Look, I think it's great that to hear that government is really curious about this, and that there is opportunity to really influence the legislation that, you know, we've been given the period of time that we have been. It's still short. I'd scribbled down some notes for closing, and to be really honest, I think Wendy has already said the key issues I had written down. You know, this will be a commission for children and young people, and And I would really encourage people, as Wendy did, to really, when you're considering the sorts of things that you might want to focus on in any feedback to government, really placing children at the centre. Think about whose needs are being served with various provisions. And the other thing we've been talking about here is the importance of legislation actually being clear and concise and accessible and understandable. And, you know, I think if you adopt a child-centred lens, and obviously also, you know, thinking from the perspective of Aboriginal children and young people, is do you understand what this legislation is doing? Is there anything that requires clarification? Could we explain this to children? We're doing some work to elicit the views of children and young people at the moment. We've sent out, at the request of, you know, hundreds of organisations, over 4,500 postcards. So I'm really looking forward to being able to include in my submission the sorts of things we're hearing from children. But yeah, I think Wendy really summed it up so beautifully.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you and everyone in this conversation today, for your time, for your questions, reflections. I'm just popping my email in the chat for anyone who would like to talk to TasCOSS a bit more about, you know, our submission, to be involved in any way. And we will send out some resources, including the resources that we shared in the chat following this conversation. But we would love to hear from you. And as Wendy said, and I'm sure Isabelle's the same, any request for information, we really want people to be as informed as possible and as engaged as possible in this process. So anything that we can do to facilitate that would be really great. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Meg. It's been great.
Okay, thanks, Izzy.
Thanks. See you, Wendy. Bye, everyone.
Bye.